The dialectical method is a method that was used by Hegel in his philosophical writings and was also then later utilized by pastors and preachers, particularly in the early 19 to mid 1900s. Some of the best known practitioners of this methodology are Harry Emerson Fosdick and Samuel DeWitt Proctor, to name only a few. It is a very deductive style, and it is much more detailed in terms of the overall form than, say, the 4 pages of the sermon. So I'd like to just talk briefly about each of the pieces of the form. And you would begin with the subject, and the subject is the title of the sermon, followed by the proposition. Now, the proposition is the very focused statement, one sentence statement about what the sermon is going to say and do. What is the main point that people should walk away with? And so this is kind of the guiding piece for where the sermon will end, where it will go. Followed by 2 pieces, 2 parts, the thesis and the antithesis. Now, these 2 pieces can actually be interchanged with one another depending on where you want to start or how you're wanting to structure your overall communication. So you can actually begin with the antithesis and the thesis. I'm going to do that following one of Proctor's sermons on the story of Ruth. So he begins with this proposition. There's one God, and God calls us to be one family, one community. That's his proposition. That's what he's going to communicate throughout the rest of the sermon. And he's going to do that through the story of Ruth. He begins with the antithesis, which is Orpah. In the story, Ruth and Orpah and Naomi are all married, but their husbands have died. There's been a severe famine, and Naomi decides that she's going to go back to her family. And so she tells Orpah and Ruth that they should also go back to their families. They no longer have any obligation to her. She's old. She can't give them any husbands, and they'd have to wait a long time to do that anyway. So Orpah immediately goes, does not really seem to present any sort of conflict. And so the antithesis in that part of the story is the recognition that communities living together share suffering, and it's easier to leave the family than to continue to deal with the suffering, to continue to walk on with one another and share life. So then the thesis in this particular case is Ruth. Ruth recognizes that there's one God, that they've been called to one family, been bound together, and so she goes with Naomi back to her family lands. So you have these 2 parts of the sermon, the antithesis and the thesis. Then that will be, and let me just say, I'm sorry, the proposition and the thesis are connected. The thesis is the kind of expansion of the proposition. So you're getting a little bit more flesh on it in the thesis. Then the antithesis and the thesis are followed by the relevant question. This is the part where we begin to move towards current day application. So the question that Proctor asks is this even possible? Is this kind of community possible? Then from the relevant question, he moves to the synthesis. The synthesis is the answering of that relevant question in 2 to 4 points generally. And those 2 to 4 points are building a case. They are the body of the sermon. They are building a case for why it is possible. They are building a case for the proposition. So you might talk about the moral reasons, you might talk about the theological reasons, the psychological, the philosophical, whatever, but building a case. Now, one of the questions that Samuel DeWitt Proctor answers in his book is dealing with the conclusion. How do you do the conclusion? What should the conclusion be? He does not necessarily do a full-on conclusion. He believes that the final point that you have developed should act as a conclusion if you have built a good enough point. So the points should actually be kind of a gradual building up on top of one another so that the final point becomes a conclusion. Now, one of the things that we should mention, because this is a deductive sermon, so you're building a case, you have a few points, is that it can often communicate implicitly, perhaps, that this has said everything that is possible to say about the issue that is being preached about. So it gives this idea of kind of finality, as closure, of no longer perhaps needing to be revisited or further discussed and developed. So it can often create this idea that there's only one way to deal with the text, or only one way to deal with this issue. And so we have to be very careful, because it does give a sense that you're preaching as an authority figure, and what that can create within the community itself is this idea that the preacher has everything settled and figured out, and that there's nothing else to wrestle with or think about. So you have to be very careful in how that comes across with your parishioners. And I would suggest one of the things that you can do is actually use other kinds of forms that might be more inductive, so that it also continues to help us wrestle with this and to leave things sometimes open-ended. But anyway, this is a little bit more detailed, intricate form that can be utilized with great passion and to great effect. And it's been and continues to be a form that has been very popular, particularly in the African American church. So it's been a form that is very powerful and continues to be.